The Stranger by Silas Sedgwick. For Theia. Prologue. The Bang. Stanley Woodruff tilled his knees into the earth as he curled himself fetal. He hoped beyond measure that he could make himself so small that he would somehow vanish completely. Unfortunately, as his forehead met the ground, he knew he had come to the end of his last road. He stared at the dark dirt just beneath his eyes, a blue in the moonlight that turned black as it mixed with his own sweat, and then purple with his blood. He could smell the rotting fish and the stinking algae from the stagnant lake nearby. Was this to be the last thing he smelled? The last time he saw anything? Is this where he dies? No, it wasn't fair. He was a good man. He didn't do anyone any harm. He made mistakes, but always with the best of hopes, of intentions. Intentions. The road to hell, they say. His daughter's wedding was in 3 weeks. He was supposed to give her away. He was supposed to do so many things he will never do again. The night was alive throughout the woods surrounding the lake. Cicadas by far the loudest voice in the choir. Owls, frogs, and other insects also sounded off. The man above him probably heard every beat of their song. Stanley could only hear silence, a deafening and ominous silence. He didn't notice the bright full moon, or its reflection flickering on tiny ripples across the entirety of the lake. He did not reflect on the fresh air in his lungs, nor how the same wind sang as it slid smoothly through rustling leaves and creaking branches. The fish leaping for their dinners above the surface of the lake, the stars endlessly filling the sky, it all escaped him. It was a very beautiful place, doubly so in the full moonlight. Under better circumstances, it could even be a beautiful place to die. The thought, though, would not have comforted him, even if he did have it. Time was like a dream. A cacophony of memories paralyzed him, a sobbing stone. He was drunk on a cocktail of anticipation and fear, stuck frozen in time, awaiting the inevitable. This, however, was immediately broken as soon as the stranger behind him pressed the muzzle of his revolver against the back of his head. The undeniable feel of cold, unloving metal against his skin was more sharpening than any cold shower ever was. He gasped for breath that wouldn't come. His diaphragm spasmed, and he sounded like a fish pulled out of water. If there was any strength within him to summon in that moment, it was obliterated by the click of the hammer as the gun was cocked behind him. It sounded as loud as thunder. It may well have been thunder. He could no longer grasp reality. The earth spun beneath him, and he felt sick. Stanley Woodruff closed his eyes and tried to think of his family for the last time. He thought of his kids, from young Andrea, still in middle school and in love with soccer, all the way to his oldest, Maddie, who will probably believe her father was a no-show to her own wedding in a few weeks. He thought of his wife, her best nights, her worst food, and crumbled into the realization that he failed them all. He let every one of them down, and worse, he would never be able to apologize to them for it, or tell them he loves them one last time, that he was proud of them. He collapsed once again into the earth, sobbing intensely. The stranger took a deep but easy breath as he tightened his finger around the trigger, and a loud crack rang out through the forest around him, silencing it for a few morose seconds. Chapter 1. Stanley. Stanley Woodruff completely shut down his cell phone. He was so terrified that every text or call would drench him in sweat, and the text he had just received only served to justify the stress. Adrenaline spiked his heart rate, and he started to hyperventilate. His head spun faster and faster as he struggled to regain the ability to breathe. No one had paid any mind to the nebbish 5'8" gaunt figure, even as pale and sickly as he looked. No one noticed his slightly frayed dress shirt covered in sweat and a couple of resilient lunch stains, nor his Armani shoes with scuffs on the leather that were coming unraveled at the seams in a few places. No one remarked that his jacket was a decade past season, or that his face was also so, complemented perfectly by the few gray wiry tufts still clinging to his scalp in bitter defiance. Yet, if no one noticed Stanley Woodruff at all in that supermarket line before, they very well noticed him vomiting all over the aisle before fainting and falling into the tabloid display. The commotion caused salacious rumors and bubblicious to fly all the way to check stand 3, 6 aisles over. The woman behind him cried for help but stirred not herself. The woman in front of him was causing a fuss over her ruined coat and how no dry cleaner could possibly save it. The checker was a teenager, rolling their eyes and calling out for someone to come clean the mess, and maybe someone to deal with the drunk that just passed out in his check stand line. Then he complained about how he would probably smell that all day. Stanley opened his eyes a few seconds after passing out, but it took a few seconds more to fully regain himself and his vision. He was embarrassed. He was still afraid for his life, but for some odd reason, his shame was far more powerful. He abandoned his basket to the puddle of bile at his feet and rose from the ground. Shoppers gathered around him. Their lips moved and their faces showed concern, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. It was all blurring together. Was it the fear taking over again, or just a concussion? Either way, the dizziness was returning fast, and once more, the world swirled around him. He broke his way through the crowd and stumbled a few steps toward the door before he lost consciousness for the second time. When he woke for the second time, he wasn't even in the supermarket any longer. Instead, seemed to be in a hospital bed. The room was small and cold, painted that awful shade of white that every hospital is painted in. Maury was on the small box television, high in the corner of the room, ruining some guy's life by telling him that he is not the father, or ruining it by telling him that he is. It smelt of piss and bleach in this room. The doctors came and went. They looked at his chart and said a lot of words, something about his heart, beta blockers, and taking it easy. How long had he been out? He was snagging an OJ and some bagels for breakfast when everything happened. What did happen? The last thing he remembered was getting a text. The text. Instantly, everything flooded back to him. The text message from Big Polly. Turning off his phone. The world twirling away to a gut-wrenching infinity. The clock on the wall said 3, and he could take that to mean PM. He sincerely doubted that he had fainted for more than 12 hours. The doctors would have been more alarmed, and they would have run more tests. When the nurse came in to draw some blood, he asked about discharging himself. The nurse replied that it wouldn't be much longer, but his family had come to see him. She was to let them back after sampling his blood. His wife entered around half an hour later, with their youngest 3 in tow. The girl was Andrea, 13 years old. She was a bit of a tomboy. She liked sports, and could usually be found with dirt on her clothes and some rustled up hair that her mother affectionately referred to as the rat's nest. The boys, Alex and Connor, were both 15 and very disinterested in the entire experience. His oldest son, Gregory, was off to college and couldn't make it on such short notice, obviously. Stanley thought of him in that moment, as his wife and daughter simultaneously started to fill his ears. He explained everything he could grasp from what the doctors had told him, and that they said he would need to make an appointment with the cardiologist. He could see the fear in her eyes in the form of tears, slowly welling as her pupils widened. It was time to tell her the truth. If he didn't do it now, he might not ever get the chance. He gave some pocket change and a few bills to his kids, with instructions to go raid the vending machines while he talked with their mother. They had heard similar commands before and exited knowing to take their time to return. When the kids had left and the door slowly closed, his wife looked more worried than ever. He took her hand and apologized. He apologized over and over, and even started crying himself. His wife's worry had turned into sheer terror, and she demanded that he tell her what was going on. He told her that the family restaurant had been declining for a while now, and nothing he did seemed to invigorate the place or entice customers to return. They had been bleeding money for years now, but the expenses kept coming. Worse still, the expenses only got more expensive. With his daughter's wedding and their son in college, the twins would also be going in a couple of years. He had to take out a small loan to help them get by, just until business picked back up again. But they had already mortgaged the house to pay for the remodel of the restaurant, which now seemed so pointless. He swallowed hard and confessed that he had taken a loan from Big Polly. Big Polly was exactly who he sounded like. He was a loan shark, a knee breaker, a good fella they called them. He was 6'3" and at least 300 pounds of greed and indifference. Of course, Stanley was never going to be able to pay the money back to Big Polly. He was deluding himself to fantasize he could. Business never picked back up, and Polly never expected it to. Polly didn't really want Stanley to succeed. Polly wanted his restaurant. When ultimately proposed, Stanley refused. It may have been dying under his stewardship, but it was all that he had to leave for his children. All he could leave for his wife to make ends meet. This refusal is what had upset Polly. He was not a man unaccustomed to getting his way, and Stanley Woodruff was neither a man of size nor position that he would have found himself denied by. It was an outrage. It was disrespect, and disrespect would be the last slight against him that Big Polly would tolerate. He would make a lesson for everyone with this Stanley Woodruff. It appeared as if that lesson was sorely needed. His wife collapsed into tears that gave way to anger and then panic. What would they do? He squeezed her hand tighter and reassured her, as husbands do. quelled her fears, and made sure that she knew, understood, and believed that he had a plan, that everything was going to be okay. She forced a small smile and kissed him. Shortly after, Andrea came back in loaded with soda and candies. The twins were still in the lobby, flirting with the intern stuck on receptionist duty, and all the immature bullshit that it brings. They finally returned to the room as well when they saw a nurse worth following entering the room to inform him that they are beginning the discharge procedures. He kissed his family goodbye and changed out of the gown and into his outfit. This outfit used to say, "I'm the boss," but now it just screamed goodwill. It was a microcosm of his entire life, and the thought, though brief, was existentially crushing. He adorned himself with his trinkets, broken Rolex, wedding ring, and gold chain. Shortly after that, the nurse returned with discharge papers. He finally left the room around 5 p.m. This event had cost him the entire day. Walking past the nurse's station, he noticed that all the young nurses were still skinny and full of energy, while the older ones had put on weight and relegated themselves to paperwork easily done in a chair. He noticed the smell of hand sanitizer and cafeteria food that was on a cart in the corner, doubtlessly meant for patients staying overnight, as if they weren't being tortured enough. He noticed a kid running in the wait area, and the man with the blue hat getting a soda next to her. Their eyes met, and Stanley looked away as quickly as he could, and continued down the hallway towards the front door. He walked through the automatic sliding doors and stopped a few feet after to light a cigarette. Checking his pockets, though, he couldn't seem to find his lighter. Did he forget to grab it from his things? Unlikely. More likely that he was bicked by that hairy orderly that gave him his stuff back. He looked like a pothead. As Stanley stood there patting his own pockets over and over, as if a lighter would magically appear in one if he tried long enough, a man came up from behind him and offered out his hand clutching a lighter. The man struck the bick and the flame rose to Stanley's cigarette, crackling as the end turned red and then gray. Stanley looked up and thanked the man he had seen earlier upstairs in the blue hat. Chapter 2. The Stranger. The stranger was a tall man, athletic yet slim. He was imposing, sure, but he was no longer any Arnold Stallone. Most of his hair had fallen out, and he had shaved the remnants. His dark, sunken eyes belonged to someone that hadn't slept in days, even though he had just woken up. He woke naked in silk sheets with 2 females and another male, all naked and haphazardly angled about his bed. Their services had all been paid for, and yet as necessary as they were at the time. At this point, they were very much in the way. He gave each of them another $100 bill on top of payment and tip for cab fare, and ushered them out of his penthouse. As his feet slowly woke underneath him, he stumbled through the living area and started the needle on an Etta James record sitting in the player. Making his way to the kitchen and its espresso machine, he performed the motions and prepared himself mentally for another pointless day. They had all been blurring together, and none of them seemed to matter or hold something new anymore. His boredom was long past depression levels, and lethargy had been the ticket of late. He poured enough whiskey into his coffee to make sure that it was more Jameson than latte. Then he stared out of the huge windows that would dwarf most homes' modest walls. The sun had long been up. The sky was blue. Everyone was out and about. Miserable. At least there was supposed to be a thunderstorm tonight. It was always interesting to sit and watch the lightning pour over the sky from his box over the city. Beautiful, even. For now, he had a headache. He moved to his white couch, sipping his cocktail. As he placed his mug on the crystal coffee table, he picked up his phone and looked through the messages. Etta James belted out the line, "Just sitting here thinking." Then he saw the unread message from sender Boss. His attention was immediate and undivided. He read the message a couple of times to memorize it as best he could, then deleted it. He chugged his coffee drink and rose from the couch, arms wide and stretched, greeting the day with renewed purpose and interest, his well-toned glutes lit and warmed by the afternoon sun. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Shortly after noon. His target, he was informed, was recently admitted to St. Lawrence's, but how long he would be there was anyone's guess. Of course, the boss had girls down at the hospital to slow things up. Regardless, he knew he shouldn't fuck around and get his ass down there. He dressed in blue jeans and an odd t-shirt he picked up once in the mall. It had a band name on it that he'd never really heard of and looked atrocious, but normal. In the bathroom, he shaved his face and brushed his teeth. There was a large regimen of medication on the counter that were mostly legitimate legal prescriptions. He went through them one by one, then chased them with aspirin powder. Next, he tackled the 2 lines of cocaine on the mirror he left out for himself on the counter the night before. Turning on the tap, he let water drip onto his hand, and in turn, into his nose. He took a deep inhale and stared at himself in the mirror. This was insane, even for him. There was absolutely no time to prep or plan. Smash and grab. Well, grab and smash, more like. He'd have to use his own vehicle and his own gun. Damn. He liked that gun. He would have to toss it after the job, of course. Normally, he would never accept such an ad hoc impulse hit. It was beyond sloppy. Still, it excited him, and he liked being excited again. He saw it as a challenge, and he was happy for it. Lacing up his boots, he kept snorting to pull more of the coke up through his nasal cavity. The box safe from under the bed was already out on the floor, wide open and empty of contents. He started to grab the doorknob, but stopped when he caught himself in the mirror. He looked like shit. He looked like an escaped convict without hair, and he couldn't get over the biting feeling that he had the appearance of a man decaying. Grabbing a blue hat from the coat rack, he reached for the door and walked out, letting the door slowly close and automatically lock behind him, leaving Etta James singing soulfully to no one as he headed toward the penthouse elevator. He knew where St. Lawrence's was. In fact, he knew the corridors and crew completely. He frequented the joint far too often for his own taste. It seemed he did not usually like what they had to say to him there, and it seemed that the news was worse every time he arrived. He drove his 2-door black car smoothly along with traffic. The local non-profit radio played a very calming, light jazz that he found agreeable. The pills were hitting his stomach and making him slightly nauseous, but, on the plus side, the liquor and aspirin were also starting to do their jobs. Life had a way of leveling out, he guessed, but he also guessed that was the problem. Maybe that was the point of everything going on. Life leveling out. This job. His cancer. Maybe karma truly existed. Karma didn't look as if she had any mercy to give him. Perhaps he should have shown a little himself a few points along the way. What the fuck did it matter now? He got angry at himself when he snapped out of such thoughts lately. It's not like it ever bothered him when he was a young man. Are all his sins supposed to mean something now that he's dying? He stopped and ran into a Walmart to buy a blank black hoodie with a large single front pocket, a pack of smokes, and a lighter. Walking back to his car, he packed the smokes and tore them open with his teeth. Afterward, he opened the box and reached for one, but hesitated. He probably had some internal bout of conscience, trying to tell him that he was dying of lung cancer because of these. But the fuck it part of him overpowered any such thoughts without effort. He lit up the cigarette as he unlocked the car door and immediately started coughing. He turned his head toward the car parked adjacent to his and coughed blood onto their car instead of his own. When the fit had ceased, he entered his vehicle and continued to the hospital. Pulling up to St. Lawrence's, he circled the parking lot once, noting the cameras along the building. There was a blind spot over the parking lot near some badge-wearing cigarette smokers and a smoker's pole. He parked in the backside of that area and waited after turning off his car. He pulled from a flask he had stashed in the center console, crunched a couple of pills between his teeth, and chased them with another swig. Lighting another cigarette and stifling the urge to cough, he wrapped the hoodie around himself and shoved the revolver in his pocket. Walking towards the entrance, he finished his smoke and tossed the butt. Only then did he allow himself a cough, though he tried to keep it minor. Didn't want to be spitting blood in a hospital entrance. They might think something was wrong and ask questions. He walked past the receptionist without even making eye contact. If she had said hello, he hadn't allowed himself to notice, much less respond. He cruised easily up the stairs. Energetically even, surprising himself, as he hadn't moved very quickly or easily for months now. Nor had he honestly tried to. But today was different for him. He wasn't sitting around getting wasted enough to erase the day. He wasn't feeling sorry for himself. He wasn't just alone at home, waiting to die. Of course, for this ounce of purpose-induced happiness that he was experiencing, it meant that someone else was to lose their life. But so be it. They fucked up, whatever they did. And being that they were doing business with the boss, it's likely that they aren't a very good person either. He knew most of his targets were other mafiosos and thugs that had crossed the line, stepped on the wrong toes without knowing it, or perhaps they knew full well. He often reminded himself that he was taking out the scum. He never knew if it made him feel better, and at this point, he sincerely doubted it. Once upstairs, he rounded a corner and walked down the long off-white hallway towards the ER. The squeak from his shoes echoing down the hall was almost as unbearable as the wretched art that lined the hall. That tacky stock-framed artwork you see in every doctor's or dentist's office. It was an affront to taste. How pathetic that after all his experiences, a man of his lifestyle would die surrounded by such mediocrity. He fancied the thought worse than death, but he knew he was bullshitting himself. He was afraid, and being here only made it worse now. Coming into the emergency room, he walked directly to the nurse's kiosk. The nurse on duty wore pink scrubs, had blonde hair messily put up in a bun, and a tired face without makeup that betrayed her youth. He initiated conversation speckled with subtle flirting. She seemed receptive and even flirtatious in response. He explained that he was looking for his friend, but he didn't know what room he was in, and gave her the name Stanley Woodruff. She gave him the room number, but said that the patient's family was currently in the room with him. He thanked her and moved to the waiting room a few steps nearby. This room was even more dingy and depressing than the rest of the hospital. A 30-year-old TV set sat on the world's oldest wall mount high in the corner of the room, next to a clock with a metal cage over the glass. Inviting. The only other things in the room were 2 vending machines and the standard waiting room cast. There was the soon-to-be widow, hoping for better news than the truth. Also the mom and kids, one of those kids being more reckless than the others, or worse for luck. He hated kids. They were loud, annoying, and worse yet, unpredictable. The last thing a man in his line needs, especially when on the job. He darted to the vending machines. That corner of the room was as close to alone as he was going to get. As he slid in front of the drink machine, he overheard Stanley's wife leaving with the kids. He also overheard that he would be checking out any minute now. Encouraged by this, he sat back down, patiently awaiting his prey. He tried to ignore everyone around, pretending he was reading an e-book on his phone and waiting for good news like everyone else. The small children were quite disruptive, and their mother's attention was swallowed by her cell phone. There wasn't enough aspirin in the world for this. Sometime later, he snapped himself from a daydream. He must have zoned out on the talk show. How long had it been? Maybe half an hour? Where is this guy? The stranger stood and returned to the vending machines. As he looked to make his selection, one of the 2 kids in the waiting area approached him. He scowled menacingly and told the kid to fuck off. But what really scared the kid was catching sight of the gun tucked in the stranger's pocket. After a second's hesitation from awe, the kid ran back to her mother. Just then, he saw Stanley walking through the ER. He looked like the photos in the text, but worse. He was gaunt and older. He dressed like a man that procured his wardrobe from estate sales, and seemed paranoid. His exit was a slow one that involved taking inventory of everyone in the room on his way out. The stranger tried to act like he was buying a soda, but Stanley's eyes still met with his. His target continued toward the exit. Sloppy. That could have been a lot worse. Though, luckily for him, it appeared the target wasn't completely paranoid yet, and that should make him easier to approach. He waited 30 seconds, then followed. He had no idea how he was going to extract a full-grown man from an open parking lot in broad daylight, but now was happening regardless of plans. Walking outside, he spotted his target stopped only a few feet away from him. He was fumbling around for keys. No, he didn't drive here, the text said. A lighter. The stranger chuckled to himself quietly. It couldn't be this easy. This was supposed to be the most insane, bullshit job ever, but he seemed to be lucking out at every stage. He pulled out the lighter that he had just purchased and extended it in gesture as he approached the unwitting prey. The target's eyes were receptive, and he bent his neck down to bring the cigarette in towards the lighter as the stranger's thumb rolled backwards and a small flame rose to meet it. The trap was set and triggered in the same stroke. The poor fool even thanked him afterward. An odd rabbit, thanking the wolf for offering his teeth. Chapter 3. The Lake. Stanley took a deep inhale, tilting his head and closing his eyes. The first pull from a cigarette is always the best. Looking up, he recognized the man from upstairs and thanked him for the light. However, no sooner had the words left his lips than he had wished to retrieve them. The stranger didn't respond, just stared at him for a moment. Stanley instinctively recognized the look in the stranger's eyes, the look of purpose. This was no happenstance. The fear returned immediately and in full force. He felt his shirt soak with sweat and stick to his chest. This man was here to kill him. This was real. It was happening, and it was happening faster than he could grasp, much less deal with. The stranger cautiously exposed enough of the revolver in his hoodie to make his point, confirming Stanley's internalizations. "Black car, back of the lot," the man said, nodding. "Let's go." He led Stanley to his car, pushed him down into the passenger seat, and calmly walked to the driver's side. He removed the gun from his pocket as he sat in the driver's seat and pointed it directly at Stanley now, making sure the threat was clearly visible. "Glove box. There's zip ties and duct tape. Don't fuck around, okay? Zip tie your legs together and then duct tape your mouth shut." Stanley sat jaw agape, trembling hard enough to shake the car. After what felt like an hour of thinking, but was closer to 4 seconds, Stanley turned and tried to bolt out of the still open passenger door. The man grabbed Stanley's pants, sending him tumbling out face first onto the asphalt. He scrambled to his feet as quickly as he could to run, but by the time he rose to his feet, the stranger was in front of him. The man pistol-whipped Stanley in the face and shoved him back into the car. This time, the attempt was carried out with a lot more force and a lot less care. Also, this time, he shut the fucking door. He sprinted back to his side, checking to see if anyone witnessed the outburst. He didn't see anyone in the parking lot or entranceway calling for help, or recording him. He slid into his seat and exhaled deeply. This was getting fucked on a dime. He turned to the pathetic, sobbing mess that was bleeding all over his car. "You stupid motherfucker! I told you not to fuck around. What did you think was going to happen? Next time I don't fucking chase you. Understand?" The stranger yelled coldly. He shoved the gun firmly into Stanley's cheek, almost more for dominance than threat. The yelling had gotten to him, though, and he coughed for a couple of minutes before catching his breath. "What happens to you is on you. I'm going to say this again, for your health. Don't make any decisions. Okay? Okay. Now take out the zip ties and duct tape from the glove box and tie yourself up." Stanley could hardly think. He heard the words, but they hit his brain just as waves would smash against the shore, with violent intensity, only to calmly dissipate out into nothing. The stranger screamed at him again, and survival instinct snapped him out of his fugue long enough to snap the handle of the glove compartment and let the door fall open. He grabbed the duct tape, and only then noticed that he was bleeding. His quivering hands, coated in red, painted the silver strip as he ripped it from the roll and put it over his own mouth. The stranger leaned over to zip-tie Stanley's hands together. Afterward, he put the car in drive and peeled out of the parking lot. Jesus Christ, this was way off the rails. Someone had to have seen that escape attempt. Even if they hadn't, it didn't matter. You don't stay ahead of the game this long by living on hope. He couldn't take the chance. He would have to destroy his car now. He may even have to leave town and ident swap again. That would be tiresome in his current condition, to put it mildly. He looked at Stanley. The wild-eyed animal was in full flight mode, pressed fast against the window as if to get as far away from his predator as possible. The stranger sighed. "It's all right. I'm just taking you to talk," he said with a pinch of honey in his gravelly voice. Silence. The rabbit was still petrified with fear. The stranger had never lied to a mark to comfort them before, and after failing his first attempt, his voice soured. "Just look out of the fucking window and nod at me," he snapped, turning on the radio to drown out the nasal wheezing. Stanley quickly turned his gaze through the window and held it fast for the remainder of the car ride. How was this real? His denial refused to let him grasp the gravity of the situation. Hope constantly overriding the logic center in his brain, screaming out the desperate truth. Human beings. Always defiant to reality. Nothing bad could ever happen to us, and the ending will always work out somehow. As the car kept traveling, however, the shock settled down, and he found himself more and more capable of rational thought. He was going to die. This was it. The end of him. Forever. An endless nothing. Just no more him while everyone else went on watching movies, going to work, and living life. The earth will still spin, and before too long had passed, no one would remember him or speak of him any longer. It would be like he never existed. The concept of not existing forever was almost impossible to conceptualize, and even harder to swallow. Trapped in his head, the ride seemed to take hours. He hadn't even paid attention. How could he with a million thoughts coming at him at once? With a stronger grasp of his senses, he tried to gain his bearings. He knew that there was nothing he could do until the car stopped, but afterward, he had options. The driver seemed to be drinking heavily from a flask, and more than slightly irritated, but Stanley had no measure of his impairment. The man also smoked constantly, and had a wicked cough for it. Perhaps he would be winded easily in a chase, to which Stanley reminded himself that he could not outrun a bullet. The landscape behind the windows was forested. He hadn't noticed leaving the city, and doing so now had caused a lump to rise in his throat. No chance that they were going anywhere to talk, and that left him with his original assumption that this man was sent to kill him. Did the man expect him to dig his own grave? Could he be reasoned with? Bribed? Begged? Could Stanley get the drop on him with a quick, bold action in the dark woods? A surprise attack on a professional hitman? Maybe he should just try talking his way out of this. By the time the car began to slow for the first time since hitting the interstate, the blood on Stanley's forehead had dried. His face was slightly stuck to the window with the weakest of seals. If, in his days, time had been flowing slower before, it was overcorrecting as the car pulled off to exit the interstate. Time then seemed to pour through his fingertips. Now, as he wanted more than ever to cling to his final moments. The hairs stood up on the back of Stanley's neck, and a bad feeling shivered through him as soon as they drove through their exit. It was one of those country exits, with no postings, that you never see anyone on. Dread held him captive, and his only defense was to convince himself that this couldn't have been happening. He was a good man. He didn't deserve this. Not this. Not taken out to the middle of nowhere and disposed of like diseased trash. He was only a little late, and he was going to repay Polly as soon as he could. Honest. Polly should even be happy for the interest. Or maybe they would come threaten him like in the gangster films he watched as a boy. But this was so extreme and so abrupt. Life, without warning, pivots on a dime. They drove down the narrow country road for a few miles, then turned off onto a smaller gravel road, detouring into the trees lining the highway. A few more miles and again the car turned off into an even more primitive road. This one wasn't even a road, just two lines where truck tires had beaten a path in the brush, and even that was becoming overgrown. Trapped in his odd limbo of feeling frozen in time whilst it ticked away rapidly, Stanley stared at the passing foliage, hoping the car never stopped. The tape over his mouth softly flexed in and out as he hyperventilated through his broken nose, wheezing like a dog's squeak toy. As the brush around him cleared and the car slowed to a stop in front of a large, dark lake, the squeaking grew in speed and intensity. The stranger killed the ignition and drew the keys. For a small moment, no one moved, and the silence was deafening. The darkness of the lake, a great nothingness expanding forever in front of them, hit ominously in the gut of both men. Getting out of the car finally, the stranger closed his door and walked around to the passenger side. The symphony of the scenery was alive with all sorts of insects, frogs, and owls. In the dark, the song seemed haunting and tense. He opened the passenger door and cut the zip ties away from Stanley. "Get out," the stranger said, ripping him from the car and letting him fall onto the ground. He shut the door with his left hand, whilst pulling the revolver out for appropriate effect with his right. Grabbing a handful of Stanley's jacket, the stranger yanked him to his feet. "Let's go." Still clenching Stanley, he started pushing him roughly toward the water. Stanley drowned in a waterfall of endless terrified brain patterns. Still, one foot went before the other, each step closer to perpetual nothingness. If there was any hope, any chance at all, now was the time. He had to take it, and as they walked, he slowly reached up and pulled the tape from his mouth. It tugged at his skin and the hair on his face, but pained him no more than his burning nose. Another step. Another. "You don't have to do this," Stanley softballed shakily. Step. Step. "You don't have to talk either," the stranger responded bluntly. Step. "Come on, man. You got me. I'm scared shitless. I get the point. I'll get the money." "It's too late for that. They don't send me to negotiate." Stanley knew what they sent the man for. He did not need it spelled out. A few more steps. Not much further to the water's edge. "What do you want from me? Money? I'll pay you. Here, take my Rolex. Just let me go." No response. "Please, man. No one will ever know. I'll disappear." "Do us both a favor and shut the fuck up." Coming close enough to the water, the stranger halted the march. "This is far enough." "Oh God, please," Stanley begged, falling to his knees. Whatever composure or dignity had remained in the man was killed off there along with the last of his hope and denial. "I've got kids. 5 of them. My oldest is getting married soon. My youngest is still in middle school. Please."
They need their father.
He debated looking down in pitiable submission or showing his face to humanize himself to his attacker. He looked down.
It's just my job. You fucked up, or I wouldn't be here.
The stranger replied with contempt in his voice now. Pity wasn't working, and Stanley looked up at the man.
I just borrowed money for my family. I was going to pay it back.
Stanley whimpered, meeting the man's eyes in the dark.
It looks like you weren't.
Just a dry spell at my restaurant. Don't you guys do late fees?
The stranger shook his head, half in amusement and half in annoyance.
I told you that's not my department.
Take me to see him.
Stanley had thrown out his most desperate Hail Mary.
Take me to Polly. I can explain everything. I'll sign over the restaurant. That's what this is about, isn't it? I'll do it, I swear.
Stop,
the stranger said flatly.
I can work it out with him. I'm worth nothing dead, but alive I can...
You can what?
His voice no longer devoid of emotion.
What are you gonna do? Huh? You think we'll just walk in there like best friends? Then what, huh? You think he'll listen to you? Fuck, do you think you'd even get to speak to him? He wants you dead, asshole. He made the call. It's done. He'd have me killed for pulling a fucking stunt like that. What the fuck do you think this is, the movies? Listen, pal, this ain't the fucking movies. This is real life shit right here, and I've heard it all 1,000,000 times before.
He coughed and jerked his gun as if to intensify his point.
Please, have mercy. I don't want to die.
Stanley broke down.
We all gotta die sometime.
Not like this.
The broken man sobbed. Snot, blood, and tears flowed together down his face.
So when you're 90 would be better. A few more blinks of the cosmic eye. And for what? To degrade? Every day worse than the last? The days aren't worth anything when you're demented. And there are no good ways to die. Trust me. I would know.
Please, please, no. I'm a human being. I want to live. I don't deserve this. Just give me a chance. I'll give him the restaurant.
Stanley pleaded.
Are you deaf? The only thing I'd be giving you is a chance of getting us both gunned down tomorrow. That's enough. Have a little dignity. They say true acceptance is embracing death,
the stranger said. He had spent some amount of time lately trying to convince himself of the very same argument.
Wouldn't you rather face it on your own terms? You only get one go, and there's probably nothing after. Just cease to be. Forever.
You're wasting my time for a few measly seconds. Another word out of you and I'll break your jaw. Let's not make this any more unpleasant than it already is.
He paused, then swirled his gun in a small circle.
Turn around.
Stanley turned away from the man, crying louder. He bent over completely and curled himself into the tightest ball that he could manage. This was it. No escape. No more chances. His eyes clenched shut, everything tunneled. He could hear his tears hit the ground. The stranger sighed, eased his posture, and slowly approached Stanley. Nearing his target, he raised his revolver and pushed the muzzle against the back of Stanley's head. The hair was slick with sweat and shined in the moonlight, forming a bright target in the darkness. He let his thumb slide the hammer back, cocking the gun. Off in the distance, the stranger heard the rumble of thunder, rolling over the crickets and cicadas. Stanley tried to think of his family. He wanted all of the memories to flash before his eyes. He hadn't really been there enough, or much at all. He had missed so much, and he was going to miss so much more. All he wanted was to relive what little he had gotten. Instead, his brain was an endless list of so many things he'd never do, or do again. No more movies, picnics, or birthdays. No weddings, no graduations, no apologies. No second chances. Eternal oblivion. We never learn from our mistakes until it's too late. Stanley collapsed into the dirt beneath him completely. His body convulsed as he sobbed so deeply that he choked for the effort. Stanley had no dignity, only the dying thought of failure, and for that, he had no strength to pick himself up again. The ground fell away beneath him, and Stanley started falling deeper and deeper into nothing, with no way to know when it would stop. The stranger shifted behind him, drew his breath, and then tightened his finger around the trigger. A loud crack rang out through the forest surrounding the lake, silencing the woods for a few tense seconds. Only the gentle lapping of the shore dared speak. As quickly as the night was shocked into silence, the symphony returned. Crickets called out for the return to order, and the rest followed suit. Thunder clapped again, much closer this time, and sirens could be heard from the main road, not far away. The first thing Stanley noticed is that he could hear those sirens. He dared not open his eyes. Was he shot? Did the man miss? He waited for the man to finish the job, the fear of anticipation even more palpable after hearing the first shot. Stanley held his breath until he couldn't any longer, and yet nothing came. He finally opened his eyes, but took a few more seconds to raise the courage to lift his head and look behind him. Was this how the sicko liked it? Looking at his face, his eyes? He slowly turned to look up behind him, but there was no one there. Glancing downward, he saw the bottom soles of boots that led up legs and then torso to finally the stranger's bleeding head. Stanley almost fell over again in tears from an overpowering mixture of shock, fear, and now relief. What happened? Why? He asked himself so many questions in that moment that he had no answers to. He was lost for reason, but regardless, he was alive. Minutes passed. It felt like forever. It felt like an instant. After a moment, he realized he couldn't stop staring at the corpse in front of him, the wound still pumping blood with each fading heartbeat. This man sent to kill him had for some reason killed himself instead. Though Stanley could make no sense of it, he told himself that he had been spared, that God had saved him.
Thank you,
Stanley said weakly. Still on his knees, he threw his head back and gazed upwards as a cool rain slowly started to fall on him. A few drops became a storm soaking him, washing away the dirt, sweat, and blood covering him. Stanley collected himself, stumbled to his feet, and started walking toward the safety of society, held in the sirens on the road. Epilogue. 6 months later. Stanley found himself remarking lately how quickly he had adjusted to his new life. Even signing his new name was immediate and second nature now. The wife wasn't overly thrilled to say the least, but even she seemed to be having fun traveling. They were making the most of the situation, which, to be honest, so far only seemed to force them to live a life they wouldn't have without the push. His daughter had gotten married, but Stanley had to settle for the photos. He had to completely cut ties with both of his adult children, for their sakes. However, they still had the youngest 3 in tow. He found himself having fun again lately, looking over his shoulder less, breathing easier and easier every day. Life had given him a second chance, and he had no desire to waste it. He was going to be a much better family man, for the family he had left anyway. Everyone was awake in the hotel room and getting ready to go for a big day at the food festival that this new town was known for. The twins were fighting over who got the shower first. His daughter was doing her makeup with her mother and teaching her the tips she had seen online. To pass the time, Stanley grabbed the empty ice bucket and excused himself from the overcrowded room. Walking down the hallway, he could only think of the fried delights coming his way later. Corn dogs, funnel cake, and his favorite, fried Oreos. He rounded the corner and entered the little room with the ice machine and stood next to a man getting a candy bar from a vending machine. As Stanley propped the bucket onto the lever for ice, the man turned to him. Standing over him in the claustrophobic space, the man called out Stanley's name and asked if he had a light.